Hello, listeners. It's Susan here, and I have some exciting news I want to share with you all. As many of you know, I've been helping you navigate divorce and life beyond through the Divorce and Beyond podcast. But now, turns out, I have a new adventure on the horizon. I want to introduce you to Turns Out, my brand new podcast, which will be launching in the new year. This show is going to be all about life's unexpected twists and turns, those aha moments that change everything. So this will be from career pivots to personal revelations. We will be exploring the stories that prove life is full of surprises. I can't wait to share more with you, but for now, make sure to visit turnsoutpodcast.com and keep an eye out for our launch drop. You don't want to miss any of the inspiring stories, and you might even hear a few familiar voices. So stay tuned and remember, turns out life has so much more in store than we ever imagined.
Coming up on today's episode of the Divorce and Beyond podcast.
Even though cruelty was a grounds for divorce, it wasn't protecting victims of violence in marriages. No fault was seen as a solution to that. You know, within 10 years, I think the majority of states had it. I think within 20 years, almost every state had it. States reluctantly accepted it, not because they liked divorce, but because they recognized that it was needed and the fault grounds were actually limiting divorce to fault grounds was actually deadly, particularly to women.
Hello, and welcome to the Divorce and Beyond podcast. I'm Susan Guthrie, your host. As a top divorce attorney and family law mediator for 30 years, I know what you need to know to get through your divorce, and most importantly, how to move beyond it to thrive and transition to your new future. My experts and I are here to give you the insider view into the process, so listen in for the wisdom and expert information you need on your journey through divorce and beyond. Hello, and welcome to today's podcast. I'm Susan Guthrie, your host, and listeners. Today I have a very important topic to discuss with you, and I brought on a wonderful expert to help me have this conversation. I actually found Professor Marcia Zug when she wrote an article recently that kind of blew up all over the internet. In fact, if you've been watching my social media, you have probably seen me post about this article because I thought she did such a wonderful job explaining the difficult concept of no-fault divorce and this effort on the part of conservative politicians to perhaps repeal no-fault divorce. In fact, the title of her article was, "Why Are Americans Fighting Over No-Fault Divorce? Maybe they can't agree on what marriage is for." So I immediately, when I saw this article, reached out to her, and thank you very much, Marcia, because she immediately got back to me and said she'd be delighted to come on the show. So first off, let me just thank you for making the time and for writing the article in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, this is a conversation that needs to be had. Actually, my friend Kate Anthony, who has the Divorce Survival Guide podcast, recently had another conversation about this issue with our friend Erin Levine. But I really wanted to be able to dive underneath and get into a true understanding for my listeners. And you and I were just speaking a minute ago. My listeners are mostly people who are thinking about getting divorced, going through divorce, and maybe about 20% the professionals who help people go through divorce. And so when I saw your article, and just to give a little more understanding of Marcia's expertise, she's a law professor at the Joseph F. Rice School of Law at the University of South Carolina. And her latest book, love this title, is called You'll Do, A History of Marrying for Reasons Other Than Love. Right? That explores the instrumental use of marriage and the role of marriage in a modern society. So her article completely builds on that. And I think that is what made me reach out and really want to have her come on so we can talk about this. Many of you out there listening have some idea of what no fault divorce means, or you have an idea of what you think no fault divorce means. But Marcia, maybe we can start with your law school professor definition of what no fault divorce means.
And I'm actually in the midst of teaching the difference between fault and no fault to my students right now. So I'll give you the same answer. So in certain states, you have two types of divorce. South Carolina, you have the option for fault and no fault. Traditionally, we only had fault, which meant that people who wanted to get divorced had to have a fault ground. And these would be limited claims that they could make for why they could get divorced. They would be things like adultery, physical cruelty, habitual drunkenness. And if you didn't have one of those grounds, you could not get divorced. And I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about the problems that came with only having a fault-based system, but those became clear. And beginning in the late 1970s, no fault swept the nation, and California was the first state to pass it. And the idea with no fault is you can get divorced outside of those limited grounds. You don't have to prove grounds. You don't have to say why you want to get divorced. You can get divorced simply because you want to. And the only requirements are meeting the time, usually living apart for a certain amount of time. South Carolina is 1 year separate and apart. Once you have done that, then you can file for divorce. You can get a divorce. Why you want the divorce doesn't come into it, and you won't be turned down. It's just a procedural issue. Have you met the time requirement? And the time requirement varies by states, but a year is pretty typical.
Yeah, and I'll say, you've sort of hit it on the head, and I want to make sure people understand here that no fault refers simply to the ability to get a divorce. It doesn't have anything to do with who was at fault and who should be punished and what happened in the marriage. It takes that out of it so that the divorce can happen, because you just said if you didn't have fault grounds, so if you couldn't prove, say, adultery is the one I think that pops into everyone's mind first. If you couldn't prove your spouse committed adultery, then what happened?
You couldn't get divorced. And in certain states, if both of you committed adultery, you couldn't get divorced. So both of you are cheating, both of you want out of this relationship. And because both of you are doing it, you again lose the grounds for the divorce.
So you had to stay in a relationship that was clearly not working for one of you. And if you were the one whose spouse cheated, you had to stay married to the person who betrayed you because you couldn't prove the cheating in a courtroom. And, one of the things that Marcia, Professor Zug, and I both know, there was one thing about knowing in your gut your spouse is cheating, and it's another thing to go into a courtroom and provide actual proof at a legal level that meets legal standards that they are committing adultery, right?
Yes, and different states get around it different ways. South Carolina, we allow circumstantial evidence, so we don't need the video of the actual physical act. But there are problems when you loosen the standards too, because, as I'll say to my students, have you ever known anyone to kiss someone and not sleep with them? Absolutely. Right. So what the circumstantial evidence shows may be, well, it's circumstantial, right? It may not be proving what the court will wind up saying it proves, so people can get caught up in this who maybe shouldn't. My students yesterday, when I was talking about adultery, they were all like, kissing's cheating, thinking about someone else is cheating. So maybe we wanted that very easy to prove standard, but lots of states didn't have that. And even if you have a fairly generous standard on it, you just might not catch them in the act. Like you said, it in your gut, they've been cheating, but you don't have any proof.
And if you didn't have the proof, within whatever the context your state required, you were going to stay in that marriage. You're going to remain married to that person. And the other aspect of it, by the way, this is making me think of that case that's in the news so much right now, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and he had I think it was all sexting and email type, what did they call it? Inappropriate relationship with a reporter. And I actually asked on my Instagram feed around that story, I said, does it make a difference, to those who were seeing that post, does it make a difference if it was never a physical relationship? And I do have to say, very unscientific poll that I took, but it was 80% of people said absolutely no, it makes no difference. What was going on there was infidelity. But the other aspect, and I say this as a practitioner, as a family law divorce attorney practitioner for so long, I've had some cases where we were proceeding on fault grounds for a variety of reasons. And it can be very expensive and time consuming to gather your evidence, circumstantial or not, of say adultery or habitual cruelty or ongoing alcoholism or drug abuse. The number one way most people will go get that type of evidence is to hire a private investigator, right? That's the tried and true, get, Sam Spade on the job and go out there and follow him around and get the pictures or the video you're talking about. But let's not forget Sam Spade gets paid, $150, $200 an hour, and it probably takes him days upon days of tailing that person in order to pull that together. So that was another aspect of fault-based divorce. Is it wasn't just proving it, it was like it was the whole hurdle you put in place before people to try and even get the evidence of what they needed to get into a courtroom.
Absolutely. So it was either you might not be able to prove it. It would cost a lot of money to prove it. And then do we want to air this dirty laundry? So many couples who are getting divorced also have kids. And if the only grounds for divorce are fault grounds, you have to bring up all of these horrible things that someone has done. And then it's public. So then the kids know about all of these things. And there are definitely downsides to it. And while you're doing it too, while you are accusing the other one of all of these awful things, probably stirs it up again, right? It makes you angry again. And you're often doing this in a case where you're also seeking custody. So you're talking about this other person in a very derogatory way because they were a bad spouse, but that can sometimes come into how you're talking about them as a parent. And the two are not necessarily linked, right? You can be a terrible spouse and still a good parent. But that can be hard, I think, for people going through divorces sometimes, especially when there are fault grounds, to kind of differentiate themselves, differentiate the two, right? He was a terrible husband to me, therefore he can't be a good father. But he can be a good father. And by forcing people to rehash all of the horrible things that have gone on in the marriage, it brings a lot of acrimony to the divorce and makes negotiation and compromise much, much harder.
Much, much harder. I'm so glad you raised that, because that's probably, I think, the maybe more subtle or just less obvious to those who are listening, that this would be something that trickles down from a fault-based divorce. But it's probably the most significant result, because when you require fault, you are immediately turning this into a mudslinging fest, right? Because it's not just one way. When one person slings mud, I don't know about your experience of divorce cases, but when one person slings mud, mud usually comes right back at you.
Yes. And like I said, traditionally, that's actually a problem. So you're both slinging mud. And then it might mean that after you've done all of this, you can't actually get the divorce because you're both bad actors. So therefore, you're forced to stay together. So under the fault system, you needed to have a guilty party and an innocent party. And if you had one party that was guilty, but the other party wasn't innocent, then you weren't given the divorce. You were forced to stay together. And that's also, again, treating marriage like some sort of punishment, which I have a whole chapter on that in my book. Marrying for criminal defense, marrying as an alternative to jail. There was definitely a time where we viewed marriage as kind of the equivalent to other types of punishment, other types of incarceration. But on the whole, we tend to not think of marriage that way today.
I find that really interesting. I have to tell you, I did not know it can be an alternative to incarceration. So you can be, sent off to Australia to live your life if you're a criminal, or you can marry the guy sitting next to you here in the courtroom who probably were they also someone who was trying to avoid incarceration? So
it depended on the crime
and marry them. Okay.
But it had to do with crimes of like seduction and fornication. So you could go to jail for those, or you could marry the victim, which is highly problematic for other reasons as well. But for the court, they're like, jail, marriage, either or.
You take your pick. And probably the victim didn't get a lot of choice in that one either. So
they could turn it down, but the problem was, and the reason it was a crime was they were already ruined, right? 19th century women, if they were, they were often pregnant, and this was, for many of them, the better choice. And a lot of these fornication cases actually weren't fornication, they were rape. But again, 19th century, you're not going to be able to prove that.
And actually, now you've brought a layer into this that I think is important for people to understand, because you just said 19th century women, right? That's the 1800s, guys. That's how women were treated in the 1800s. We did not get no-fault divorce. We did not take fault out of the mix until I think California passed it in 1969 was the first year. By the way, that was Governor Ronald Reagan, who I believe had at least one divorce of his own by that time. But that was the first state and the first instance of no-fault divorce where I'm going to say this, maybe I'm incorrect, but I think that a large impact of bringing no-fault divorce to the world was that it benefited women and children.
Absolutely. The thing to recognize about no-fault divorce is how quickly it was adopted after California was the first state to pass it. And it was adopted by places, again, like South Carolina, conservative states. And it wasn't done because people in these states loved divorce. It was a recognition of the real problems that existed when you had a fault-only system. The biggest problems, we've been talking a lot about adultery, but it was really physical cruelty. So abuse in a relationship. If you couldn't prove it, you needed to stay married to your abuser. If you were afraid to accuse them of it, you couldn't get out of that relationship. People who were in abusive relationships, the longer they're together, the more dangerous it can be. It was a recognition of this, that even though cruelty was a grounds for divorce, it wasn't protecting victims of violence in marriages. And this was seen, no fault was seen as a solution to that. And it really, within 10 years, I think the majority of states had it. I think within 20 years, almost every state had it. People are often surprised that New York State is the last state to have recognized no-fault divorce, but people were still able to kind of get them in New York. New York was complicated and they had reasons of their own for holding out on that. But in general, states reluctantly accepted it, not because they liked divorce, but because they recognized that it was needed and the fault grounds were actually limiting divorce to fault grounds was actually deadly, particularly to women. We do know, taking that one step further, children in homes where there's abuse in a marriage, just seeing your one parent abusing your other parent is a form of child abuse. But usually those children come in for their fair share of abuse as well, unfortunately. Hey everyone, it's Susan. So look, we know going through a divorce is tough and self-care can easily get overlooked. I wanted to share something that helped me, and that was creating a cozy space to relax. Something that can help you is Parachute Home, which is bedding and home goods that bring real comfort.
Imagine ending your day wrapped in the softest sheets or a warm blanket. So if you're looking to add a bit of peace to your home, visit divorcebeyond.com/parachute. When you shop through my link, it supports the podcast, and you know how much I appreciate that. So remember, taking care of yourself is a big step forward. So check out Parachute Home and get yourself your own warm, cozy hug. Stay tuned to hear more from Professor Marcia Zug on the many negative impacts of the growing conservative movement to repeal no-fault divorce laws in the United States. This is another important issue to be educated on as we go into a consequential election in our country.
So if we want more people to get married, I think they need to understand both what marriage does for them and how it might be beneficial, but also, not scare them by locking them into a marriage that they could never get out of.
If you are facing divorce and want more helpful content, be sure to check out last week's episode with special guests, divorce financial experts Karen Shalhoub and Catherine Shanahan, the founders of My Divorce Solution. In this episode, they share their top tips and insights for fighting your financial fears around divorce.
With us, it's turning your fear into focus, and that focus becomes on the knowledge that the financial portrait gives to you. And that's invaluable. It's a life-changing confidence builder.
And now we return to today's show.
A significant factor I think everyone needs to know is that it worked, right? Bringing no fault to the fore and making that available to people, it worked.
It absolutely worked. Lots and lots of states became no fault only. They decided there was no benefit to having fault, and the only way you can get divorced in many states is through no fault. Other states, like the one I live in South Carolina, we have both. But it even if they had both, it changed the way it changed the importance of fault, right? So now it's okay that fault is hard to get. Right? We want it to be hard to get because you have an alternative way to get divorced. So the question is, when do we think the state should be punishing a person for things that go on in a marriage? And probably most of us think that should be a rare instance. Maybe. My students, again, going back to their adultery class yesterday, they think everything's adultery, emotional cheating, the state should come in and punish you for it. But on the whole, most people, I think, don't feel that way. But fault-based divorce has a lot of consequences, a lot of negative consequences, besides just limiting it to those grounds. Like I was saying, there's punishment that comes with it. There's fault. And when someone is adjudicated as at fault, typically that means that they're going to be maybe paying more alimony or not receiving alimony, paying more or the property distribution will be different. So the at-fault person will get less property. It can also possibly come into custody determinations. So it has a lot of implications, serious implications. And if we're going to do that, we do want to limit how easy it is to get a fault-based divorce. And it's fine because we have no fault. And these states that have eliminated fault entirely find that the benefits of punishing a party aren't worth the detriments of doing so.
And those are the detriments that we were talking about earlier, basically the ramping up of the conflict, et cetera, that happens as just a very direct result of requiring that proof of fault. So now we sit here today in a world where we know no fault divorce and its introduction has alleviated a lot of these problems of a fault-based system. And there's now what I'll call a conservative movement to repeal no-fault divorce and go back to, in my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, a fully fault-based divorce system.
I mean, there are different proposals on the table, but yes, that's the gist of it. There are a number of things going on. Some of it is people forget what it was like before we had no fault. That was a long time ago now. We've lived in a world of readily available divorce for a long time. It's also, there's a lot of concern about declining marriage rates. There's a lot of concern about maybe divorces that aren't needed. So one of the criticisms of no fault is that it makes divorce too easy. That people who aren't really thinking about it, just, oh, all I have to do is live separate apart for a year, easy, I'm going to get a divorce, which is strange because that's not what I've seen in practice, that people go into, yes, there are some people who get divorced and then they get remarried. Usually then they get divorced again. I'm talking about to the same person. On the whole, people actually think long and hard before they decide to get divorced. But there is this narrative going on that divorce is too easy. And also, this is the one that's new, that it's unfair if only one of the parties wants a divorce. That divorce shouldn't be allowed in that situation. That if one party wants the divorce and the other one doesn't, it's the person who doesn't want it who should be able to stop the divorce unless they've done something wrong.
Wrong.
And what they define as wrong is very similar to the fault-based grounds. Not wrong like you're a bad spouse, you made my life miserable, it's, you hit me, you cheated on me, you're a drug addict. Short of those sorts of things, they're like, what? The fact that my spouse just doesn't want to be with me because X, Y, and Z reasons, that's not fair.
Because they don't want to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Usually the people who are claiming this, when you learn a little bit more about their marriages, you're like, oh, well, I can totally see why your wife might want to leave you. But they see it as completely unfair because they have no say in it. Under no fault, the only requirements are that you meet the separate and apart. So yes, your spouse can leave you against your will and still get a no fault divorce.
Well, and I've had that conversation with clients over the years, right? After practicing for 32 years as a divorce attorney, I can't count how many times I've had to sit down with a client who has said, but I don't want a divorce. She said, or he said, this was for life. How can they just turn around and walk away now? And the conversation I have had with them is, so what you're saying is someone who says they don't want to be with you, you want to force them, or you want the state to force them to be with you, even though they don't want to be with you. And if you think about that, and for those who are out there listening right now, think about that. Think about what that is, what that paradigm is right there of being in a relationship and forcing someone to stay in a relationship with you when they do not want to be with you. I can't think of a sadder situation.
I agree with you, which may mean there's something else going on, right? So the sort of person who sits with that and thinks about it and doesn't come to the conclusion that that's sad, that they come to the conclusion that that's good, I think a lot of it's about control. Right? How dare they leave me? I should be able to stop them. And this goes back to a lot of the concerns we had with fault only, which was it perpetuated a lot of abusive relationships because you weren't able to leave. And a lot of the rhetoric around this seems to be about control and power and denying someone else their agency and their ability to have the life that they want, to move on, to just, to do what they think is right for them. And that's really scary because we're seeing that in general. Now I'm going to genderize it, but this idea that women shouldn't have control necessarily over all aspects of their lives, their bodies, their futures. And I do think that the current push for no-fault divorce is related to that trend, this limitation on the choices that women are going to be able to make. It's not only men who are pushing the legislation for no-fault divorce, but some of the most vocal advocates are men who are very angry that their wives are leaving them.
Right. It all started, Stephen, I think his name's Stephen Crowther, and I won't give it any more air than that. I think you just said that very eloquently because this has such a feeling of control over, and we are in a time when control over women feels like it is going backward in time. You mentioned the 19th century, the 1800s. It's women have been literally second class citizens up until and including in some cases right now as we live in this world today. This would be another step backward in large part for women and for children.
And for children. And I don't think it would do what they're hoping it would do. So when you had a fault-only system, it was much harder to get divorced, but it doesn't mean that people didn't get out of these relationships. So you have a number of different options. If you can't get divorced, you can still leave. Desertion was a major, major problem when you had limited grounds for divorce. People didn't just say, oh, well, the law won't let me leave, so I'm just going to stay with this person that I have no interest in being married to. So they would divorce with their feet. Especially in the 19th century, you go out west, you say you're a widow, great. You get remarried. There were a lot of bigamy cases. So that was one thing people did. There was a lot of collusion, right? Both parties want to get divorced. So one of you is going to have to create grounds. In New York State, there was a notorious blonde who would be seen going into hotel rooms with men who wanted divorces. So pictures could be taken. So there was proof of adultery. So, that's problematic as well. It's not good to lie to the courts, but people were going to get out of these relationships. It also created, lots of negotiation between the parties, which one is going to be the cheater, because there are all these implications that come with it. Then there was also higher rates of suicide and potentially spousal matricide. Matricide is your mother. What's killing a spouse? Because women could kill their husbands too.
Well, good question. I'm going to Google that when we have a minute, and I'll put it in the show notes, folks. If you happen to know, go ahead and write it into us. We should both know, but I don't.
There is a word. I think it's Greek.
Or Latin. We lawyers love our Latin. But well, and that's, that's significant. There's also more likely, there will be more. I mean, not that we don't live in a world that unfortunately, has a plethora of domestic violence, domestic abuse, coercive control, all of the above. We're actually taping this in October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I just direct you all to the first episode from this month if you want more information on domestic abuse, the episode I did with Beverly Price. But so can you give us sort of an update, because this isn't across the country. Not every state has something pending. I think last time I checked, there were 4 states, and I could be wrong, maybe that has advanced, but there were 4 states that either had something pending or were talking about creating some sort of legislation that would affect no-fault divorce.
It may be 4 now, but I would guess that, what's happening is it's increasing so quickly. I think last year was 3. So it may be up to 4, maybe it's 5, but the number of people talking about it is way higher than that. So sort of the timeline on this is super scary to me. The idea of getting rid of no fault, 5 years ago, not on the table. No one was talking about it. It was fringe, right? And then we have like Louisiana propose it. We have it become part of, I think, Oklahoma and Texas. I can't remember the other part. The Republican Party platforms hasn't passed, but it's part of these platforms. Now it's part of Project 25, right? So, the plan for the country potentially is this, whereas this was a fringe idea only a few years ago. Now it hasn't passed yet, but it's squarely on the table. And once something is squarely on the table, very good chance it's going to move into actually, moving off the table and getting passed, because this is what we saw with, going back to abortion again, right? The idea that Roe v. Wade would be overturned seemed unlikely. Then that happens. Oh, well, but we won't do these other things. Now those things are happening. The example I often use is IVF. When people were talking about the abortion debate and, the idea of its impact on IVF, there was so much pushback. No, this has nothing to do with IVF. Everyone loves their IVF. This is just about abortion and it won't impact IVF. And then, hey,
guess what?
Alabama says it out. Of course it impacts IVF. And then, the legislature, passes a stopgap, but it's not. Things that were fringe don't stay that way necessarily if we start seeing this movement. So yes, the idea or the fact that none of this is passed yet does not give me any confidence that this won't pass soon. The other part of this that we haven't talked about is there's an increasing fear of declining marriage rates and low fertility. You've probably seen a bunch of these articles now about how Americans aren't having any babies. Married Americans have more children. And one of the suggestions then is, we need to get more people married because that's how people have children. And then we also need to keep people married so that they will have more children. In my mind, those are not connected. In forcing people to stay married will increase childbearing, except, again, if we're talking about violence, right? Forced pregnancy is absolutely a tool of control and of domestic violence. So in that way, yes, I guess it could do that, but that can't be something that we're advocating for. So I think the idea of making divorce harder because we want people to have more babies is the wrong way to go about it. I don't know the solution. If we want more babies, we have to convince people to want more, women to want more babies, but you can't force them to. Well, I guess you can force it. Well, actually,
they're trying to right.
But that's not even working. It turns out that a forced pregnancy makes a woman, so a woman who would have had an abortion who goes on to have that child is much less likely to have future children. That your fertility rate declines in states where abortion is not legal, partially because if you have a child very, very young, it may make it much harder for you, or a child in a situation in which you're not equipped for it. It can make it harder for you to choose to have more children later. So, using this as a way to solve our looming fertility crisis seems misguided as well.
Yeah, well, and I read an article, I think it was just yesterday, that said since all of the abortion bans have gone into place, the rate of abortion has actually gone up. Trying to control women through this type of legislation is unfortunately not new in the history of the world. But unfortunately has become a part of the conversation in our country where we thought we were, as you said, oh, that could never happen. Oh, that is not on the table. It's all moving on to the table. And this is just one more symptom of that greater problem for anyone who hasn't taken a deeper dive into Project 2025. If you want to be truly horrified and scared, take a gander. And I don't want to be super political about this topic. It's not really, it's being politicized because it's become a part of certain agendas, political agendas. But this is really about control and about moving backwards instead of moving forwards to a more equal society. And we weren't even there yet, and we're moving back from it rapidly.
Yes. And it may make people even less interested in marriage. So that's, the area that I write about a lot. And one of the things that has struck me so much in recent years, one of the questions I always ask my students is, how many benefits do you think attach to marriage? Every year they throw out a number. This year, the starting bid was 10. 10, I say federal benefits, 10 federal benefits. And, then I'm like, okay, go up, and they'll say 25, 100. And I stop them because, we're going to be there all day. I tell them there are over 1,000 federal benefits alone that attach to marriage. But if you think there are only 10, they think A, that they can contract for them all, B, that that's not many, and C, you add in, you can't get out of marriage, right? That you're now, divorce is off the table. Marriage starts seeming like a really bad proposition. So if we want more people to get married, I think they need to understand both what marriage does for them and how it might be beneficial, but also, not scare them by locking them into a marriage that they could never get out of.
Right. This is, once you do this, you're in it forever. There is no going back. And many people, right? Many people might take that little, what do they call them? The cold feet the day before the wedding. Those cold feet may be walking the other way. And we do know that is one thing that's very, very clear in marriage trends is younger generations. I say this as an old person now suddenly, but, younger generations are not getting married at the same rate as, baby boomers and older. Each subsequent generation is less and less likely to get married. And I have to agree with you. You take no fault off the table for people. I think you're only going to push people further away from marriage.
It's scary. We've done other things like this. So a number of years ago, a bunch of states were proposing covenant marriage. And covenant marriage is sort of like, you didn't have to do it. So it wasn't the state passing it, but it was this option for a fault-only divorce. So people who would sign up for a covenant marriage, they would limit their divorce grounds. What's not surprising to me is that very few people took this option, that most people don't actually want it. They want to get married, but they believe in themselves, and they believe that if they're seeking a divorce, it's because they need one, that it's not up to the state to decide whether or not they have the grounds for it. They don't need a punishment to keep them married. They'll stay married as long as the marriage is a good marriage, is working for them, whatever they decide, but they trust in themselves and they don't think it's the business of the state. So covenant marriage did not take off. And now we have this push for fault only to get rid of no fault. And then people won't even have the choice. That's just what it'll be.
Right. Well, you do have the choice, because if you don't get married, you don't have to worry about it. And I think that probably that is the most important. That's where the choice moves to.
Yes.
Right. Now the choice isn't to get divorced. The choice is, should I even bother to get married, since you've taken away my options beyond that? There is no solution. I think you said that right at the moment. I think the solution is being well educated, understanding what is going on. And I'm just going to say to everyone, this episode is airing the day before one of the most important days in our country this year. November 5th is voting day. If you haven't already voted, I urge you to get out tomorrow and make your voice heard, and continue to do so, because these are the issues that are facing us on a variety of different fronts. And all I can say is, you have to vote. You have to vote. So, Professor, I could talk to you about this all day. This is a fascinating topic. I just have ordered your book. I told you you'll do a history of marrying for reasons other than love, and I can't wait to read it. I suspect I'm going to be very frustrated when I read it on what has happened in the past, and be happy that we've moved forward, but then frustrated again because we seem to be moving backward. But I'd love to have you back on once I've had a chance to read that book and continue this conversation. But I appreciate your writing the original article where I found you. I appreciate your talking about this important topic and in helping to educate our next generation of family law lawyers in South Carolina on family law. And as you said, right now you're teaching them about no fault and fault divorce. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun.
Thank you for joining me today on the Divorce and Beyond podcast. I hope you found some information and inspiration to help you on this journey. Please join me every Monday at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time for a new episode. And if you like the show, please take the time to subscribe and leave me a 5-star review on iTunes. You can also find more information on the website at divorceandbeyondpod.com, where you'll find links to the YouTube channel, transcripts of the episodes, and other bonus content. So I'll see you next week to help you move through your divorce and beyond.